Welcome to One-on-One. I'm Greg Bassey, your host from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. It's a big day here at PAC 14. It's a stressful day because we are interviewing my boss, publisher Darel La Prade of the Salisbury Independent. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
So 5 years ago this week, we started this thing together called the Salisbury Independent, and it's still going, and it seems to be popular. So I had to get you in to talk about the genesis of this thing, what we're going to do next, and what is the status of the news industry overall?
Well, 260 issues, is that correct?
Yes, 52 times 5, whatever that is. Yes.
That's pretty amazing to me. You know, if I were more skilled at doing this right now, I would hijack your show, because you are the one that should be interviewed, because you are the face of the Salisbury Independent. And we would not be where we are now without the hard work that you put in. So I just want to take this moment to thank you. I'd like to thank our readers who have been loyal. I'd like to thank all those people who have made contributions to our efforts, and thank our advertisers, most of course, and to thank our staff, Kathy Koyanagi and Susan Canfora, and a host of other people that have made contributions along the way. I don't know what your question was, but that's sort of my cold opening.
Well, that's important, because especially with the advertisers, you know, I get that all the time. When we first started this, I expected just, you know, the revenue to pour in from ads. But there were people who were watching us to see what we were doing before they invested their money, and then they came around, and things are going pretty well in that regard. So that's been great that we've been able to win the confidence of people who want to be print advertisers.
Well, I think you're right. You know, if you remember, there were a number of people that we had targeted, and we thought for sure those guys were going to come in right away.
Right.
But it took 6 months
Yeah.
Before we really began to break the ice. So,
how did we get lucky enough to come up with a product that people like? What's the key to the success of the paper in terms of the content?
well, I think the key to the success to the paper is you, frankly. I know that you and I seem to agree. The first time we met, we seemed to be talking the same language. And one of the things that I remember bringing up is that there were two kinds of journalism. There was gotcha journalism, and then there was the kind of journalism that I think we try to practice in the Salisbury Independent, which is we like to catch people doing something right.
Right.
And I remember that we talked about that, and we seemed to be on the same page. And the other thing that we talked about is I think we both agreed that no one really owns the newspaper except the readers, and that we are merely stewards. And I think that shows through on every page and every article, because it seems to me that we try not to do things for our own self-interest, but rather we are trying to do things to improve the community and build a community.
And I think that's really important. Your line in the beginning, which I globbed onto, was, yeah, we're a watchdog, but we're a watchdog with some manners.
Yeah, well, that's not really my line, but yes, it's a good line, and it's true, I think. I think we have an obligation as a member of the press to keep watch on our public officials, to make sure that the tax money is being spent appropriately, to make sure that, you know, things are being done in an honest and above board way. But at the same time, I don't think that, you know, we need to be trying to run everybody down. So.
Right. You also coined a thing which I'd never heard, the refrigerator news, the idea that you're going to put content in the paper that people might want to clip out and put on their refrigerator, their kids succeeding in school, someone getting an award.
You give me way too much credit, because I certainly didn't coin that phrase. But yeah, I think, I do think that's important. We fill a very special niche in the community. And I like to think of our newspaper as sort of the first draft of history. And that first draft of history may include someone who at some point may win an Emmy or an Oscar, and they may be in a school production. And if we're there to take their photo and put a caption and a short story about it, and it gets clipped out and put on the refrigerator, then I think that's terrific. And I think that it helps to build people's self-esteem and make people feel part of the community. And I think that's important.
All we hear about on a national scale is that newspapers are going away, but I think we've kind of proved that they're not.
I don't know exactly how to answer that. I would say that there was a time 5 or 10 years ago when people were saying, 5 years ago when people were saying the big metros are in terrible trouble, and I think that most of them still are. However, I think we also have to admit that some of the larger newspapers are now doing pretty damn good. The Washington Post and New York Times, they seem to have found their footing. The smaller newspapers, it's a tough business model yet. I don't think people realize that we actually are manufacturers, and we manufacture something every week if you're a weekly newspaper. And going into the press hall and watching the press run and watching how all of it comes together, it's a remarkable process, and it's not cheap, unfortunately, at least not as cheap as it used to be. But I do think that there will always be room for community newspapers, and I think that the Independent epitomizes what a good community newspaper ought to be. It's got excellent writing. It's got good contributions from the community, good photography, and a fair number of ads, so that it's got interest for people that pick it up.
We're creating something that's a little bit different for our customers.
What we're trying to do is to make a newspaper not out of a cookie cutter design, but rather something that is designed and aimed specifically at the market that we serve. And that's why it's so important, I believe, to have somebody like you at the helm who's so deeply ensconced in the community and knows all the personalities and has grown up here and has a real sense of what the local culture is like.
In terms of how businesses work in a newspaper business, when I was at the Daily, we had the 3 legs of profitability. We had the classified ads with automotive, we had the retail, and we had circulation. With the Independent, it's a free product, so our revenue is completely derived from the advertising.
Correct. And we just wish there were more of it.
Right. But that makes it unique in terms of we don't have those other 2 legs of the stool, so it adds pressure to everything, but at the same time, it's still very important.
The historian David Potter made the argument that advertising was one of the few things that American culture has actually contributed to the overall Western culture. We've turned it into an institution, and it is important. I mean, it's news, the way I look at it. Advertisements change every week in the same way that the news changes every week. And it's important to the local economy. It contributes to the marketplace. It's a very sensitive indicator of how the economy is doing, because advertising in newspapers like the Independent is often the first thing to go
right
when there's a downturn in the economy. So if you see our paper at 40 pages, then you know that the economy's probably doing pretty well if we're consistently at 40 pages, which we never are. But
something that's been completely different for me compared to when I worked for the Daily newspaper. People will call and say, "I love your paper. What can I do to help? How can I contribute?" So we've created a little system where people can send us money if they want.
Yes, there is. If you go to our website, salisburyindependent.net, there is a tab there where you can actually become a donor.
Kind of like the NPR model.
Well, it's sort of like the NPR model. I mean, we're nowhere near as successful.
Right.
We don't rely exclusively on donations, but it's good that people believe enough in us, believe in us enough that they will give us money. And it does help, believe me. Every penny helps, because as I've said previously, putting together a newspaper and distributing it is an expensive thing.
I'm very intrigued by what you do as a publisher. You're not just Salisbury Independent. You have several papers that are under your domain. What's it like out there in terms of the weekly world and how things are changing? How does Salisbury Independent fit into your job? What are your other papers that you're responsible for?
Well, I'm publisher of the Delaware State News, which is the capital daily in Dover.
Now, for me, that would be enough. I could not imagine having to do all the other things other than just be publisher of the Delaware State News.
Well, I think you mentioned before I arrived that I'm often late, and it could be because there's always something more to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's got to be a fire for you to put out everywhere all the time.
There is, and it's really frustrating. You know, you start out the day and you've got these grand plans about what you intend to accomplish,
Right.
what you intend to accomplish, and the next thing you know, you're down a rabbit hole trying to sort something out.
Yeah.
But at any rate, it's a lot of fun. I'm publisher of the Delaware State News. We started the Independent 5 years ago. In July of last year, we started a monthly in Dover called the Greater Dover Extra, which is a pretty unique business model. It's 43,000 copies. It's mailed, saturation mail once a month to
and I hear
5
from
zip
people
codes.
that's going really well.
So far, so good. Good enough that we started a second monthly in Smyrna. It's called the Smyrna Extra. 15,000 copies that are also saturation mailed to the Smyrna zip code and 2 other smaller zips. The weekly newspaper model, I would like to say that I believed it was going to survive and not continue to evolve, but I don't. I think it's going to continue to evolve. I've converted 2 of our longtime weeklies recently into monthlies, largely because they were dependent on what we call in the industry insert business. Those are the flyers that are
Sure.
in the paper that you shake out. We were very dependent on those, and the preprint revenue industry-wide is down year over year about 40%. That's a big hit, and it's just not one that we can survive doing the same thing over and over again. So what we've had to do is to try to figure out a business model that's going to work, continue to serve the community, and underwrite our journalism. That's the important thing. So we've converted these 2 weeklies into monthlies. We have one called the Chronicle that serves Milford, Harrington, and Felton. And then we have the Sussex Post, which serves Georgetown, Millsboro, and Long Neck. And both are saturation mailed, but they're growing.
Yeah.
The revenue's growing in them, and
And the content's been adjusted, so it's got a shelf life of a month. So it's something you can keep on your island or by the potty and keep going back to it over and over again.
actually we did an early survey with the readers of the Greater Dover Extra, and we found that the majority of the people that answered the survey keep the Greater Dover Extra for almost a month, and they return to it 4 times.
Right.
So that's pretty good. So if this is a way for us to create a business model that's successful and underwrites our journalism, the journalism at the State News, and we have no plans. We have no plans at the present to change the approach that we're taking here in Salisbury. Salisbury is a big market for us. So if we can figure out a way to continue to underwrite the journalism that you're doing, that Susan's doing, that's the important thing.
You've got some strong little papers too in Crisfield, in Somerset County, and in Cambridge, Dorchester County.
The little weekly in Crisfield, the County Times, is
Everybody reads it.
well, in my view, the County Times is the absolute model of what a small town weekly ought to be.
You've got an editor down there who writes everything, who knows everything, and they
He is-
line up to get this paper when it comes out.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's just a little paper. It's like 24 pages, somewhere between 16 and 24 pages every week. It's chock full of local news. The editor down there, Richard Crumbacker, he's from Salisbury. He's been in the business a long time. He does know everyone. He knows where all the skeletons are. If you go down to Crisfield and visit the office, it's interesting because if you're there for a day, 4 or 5 people will come in and they want to talk to Richard, and they want to find out one thing or another that they know only Richard
Right.
comprehends.
Right.
So it's pretty interesting. The paper in Cambridge is a very interesting little paper for us, Dorchester
The Banner, yeah.
The Dorchester Banner. I started work for I&I 23 years ago, and when I did, the Banner was a PM 5-day-a-week daily, which made it one of the last of its kind.
Right.
And over the years, and at the outset of the Great Recession, we had to make a move over there, and we cut the paper down to twice a week, and then not so long ago we made it once a week, and now it's seems to be much stronger than it was previously. So once a week seems to be the right frequency for Cambridge, and I think we're doing some good journalism over there too.
Now, when I was at the Daily too, I grew up reading the Salisbury Advertiser, and we used to actually compete against the Advertiser. So we jam all the Salisbury news in the paper on Tuesdays and Wednesday mornings, just in case the Advertiser was going to have the same content. And you were the father of the Advertiser, basically, and you had to make that hard decision for that paper to go away.
Actually, I don't know that I was the father of the Advertiser. I was more like the Grim Reaper. As you know, I lived here in Salisbury.
Yeah, and I think people don't know that you lived here in Salisbury for a long time.
Yeah, my wife and kids,
Yeah.
we moved here in 1994, and we lived here 9 years, almost 10 years, lived in Newtown. And I was working for independent news media. The Salisbury News and Advertiser was suffering, and they asked me to devote my time to trying to figure out a way, if I could come up with a way to save the News and Advertiser. So I hired my friend who's now passed away, C.R. Hook, whom I believe you know, and many other
Great
people.
Salisbury icon, yeah.
Yeah, and many other people in Salisbury know. And C.R. and I got to be really good friends over the years. But C.R. and I set out to save the Salisbury News and Advertising. We went out, we sold a lot of advertising. The challenge was that the distribution of the paper was just completely out of control. And people that can remember back that far, and I will never forget, my younger daughter is now 18, and I closed the News and Advertiser right after she was born. So it was 18 years ago. But the distribution, if people that can recall, it was everywhere. It was it was in the gutter in front of every house in Salisbury, just about, and it was just hard to get all of that under control. So we had to make a hard decision, and it just broke my heart. I'm not sure. I think that paper started, I think it traced its origins back to at least the 1890s, but
Yes.
I believe it was back even older than that.
Yeah.
So we had to close the paper, and we did. But when we closed it, I made a pact with then the CEO of the company, Joe Smith, that when we had the opportunity and the time was right, we would come back and reopen a newspaper in Salisbury.
And I'm glad that I was able to help with that, yes.
Well, it wouldn't have happened without you, I have to say that.
You mentioned Joe Smith and
Yes.
I&I,
Yes.
and that was part of my attraction. This is not a typical newspaper corporation.
Actually, it's not. It's true. It's a very unique Independent News Media USA, which is our parent company of the Salisbury Independent, Delaware State News. It's a very unusual company. It was it had its beginnings in the 1950s. A man named Jack Smith moved from the Bucktail Mountains in Pennsylvania, a little town called Renovo. He came to Dover in 1952. He had a little newspaper in Renovo, and he sold it and then came to Dover, and he bought a weekly paper there. It was called the Delaware State News, and it was a weekly. And his idea was that he wanted to launch a 5-day-a-week daily, and he did so in September of 1953. And it's a pretty cool story. I believe the first issue was September 19th, 1953. But it's a pretty cool story because there was the editor of the paper at the time was a guy named Jim Miller, and Jim later became legendary in I&I, in the annals of I&I. The first issue, the newsboys were outside waiting to get copies of the paper, and everything was ready to go except the front page. And they were working on the front page, and those were the days when you had to set the type by hand,
right,
and all that business. And so they were waiting to get the front page, and there was one story that was late coming in, and they got the story in, and the guy who was setting the type, he said, it's not going to fit. It's too long. It's too long. What are we going to do? And all the paper boys are outside clamoring to get the paper. They're already missed deadline, et cetera. So Jim walked over and he said, put a line at the bottom, cut it off right there, put a line at the bottom of the story that says, continued tomorrow. It sends chills down my back to this day to tell that story, because that really has been, been the story of the Delaware State News. It's continued tomorrow.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool.
When I worked for Gannett, I got in big trouble at corporate one time. We got into this discussion about who owns the paper. And at corporate, certainly the sense was the paper's owned by the stockholders of the Gannett Company Incorporated. My point was, no, the paper's owned by the readers of the community, which no one wanted to hear, because that's not really who we were working for. We were working for the stockholders. And it's a completely different attitude at I&I based on what I've seen.
Absolutely a different attitude. And the nonprofit corporation is run by 5 nonprofit trustees, and they serve staggered 5-year terms. They pledge to uphold the corporation's articles and bylaws, which are essentially that we support the First Amendment, and we're dedicated to citizen participation and informing the public so that they can make wise decisions about public issues. We've had some really bright stars on our board of trustees. They've included Ben Bagdikian, whom I know you know,
yeah,
and others probably don't, but he was the dean of the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and author of Media Monopoly. We had another really stellar guy named Andy Barnes, who was the former chairman and CEO of the St. Petersburg Times, and so the list goes. It's a long list, but we've had some really important people in the world of journalism to serve on our board, and they have all made unique contributions to I&I and helped to create this culture where I believe that we're able to attract people with talent, such as yourself, and then we're able to keep them. And and they work. Look, you're not going to get rich being a journalist. You're just not going to do that. And but I think that we have an environment that if you're dedicated to the trade and the profession, then you can really do what you want to do here. So.
Well, explain it to me. You're a smart guy. Could have been a lawyer, done something really significant and made a lot of money in business.
Yeah.
Why are you in newspapers?
Why am I in newspapers? Over the years, I've developed this idea that failed artists end up in newspapers. So I don't know that I fall into that category. I just have always wanted to be. I've always wanted to be a newspaper guy. I tell this story and people look at me like I'm crazy, but I went to this school in Virginia, a small school in Virginia, and they had, the reason I went there is they had a school of journalism, and it was purportedly one of the first schools of journalism in the country. And I went there, and as it turned out, I never once set foot in a place, but I never lost this idea that I wanted to be a journalist. So I just sort of fell into it. I started freelancing. My first job out of college, I wanted so badly to be in the newspaper business. I went to work for the Virginian Pilot, and I went to work in their circulation department. I was a district manager.
Which is the worst job in the business.
I had, no.
By like a lot.
Yeah, by a whole lot. In those days, I had 35 paper boys and 5,000 papers that had to be up by 6:30 in the morning, every morning, 7 days a week. And it was just, it was exciting. You'd be out on the streets of Norfolk, Virginia at 4 a.m. and you'd be the only one out there and you're like king of the street, But it was a lot of hard work. And after that, I went off to graduate school. I had 2 stints in graduate school. And then I came back. I moved back to Norfolk and I started stringing for the Virginian Pilot. And one thing led to another, and I ended up getting married and moving to a small town in Virginia. And I went to work for a weekly there. It was a dream job. It's called the Caroline Progress. The paper is now closed, and it was a dream job.
I think all of us that get in the business, there's like this moment where we know we've done the right thing, or where we're inspired.
Yeah, I believe that, and I can clearly identify that moment for myself. I had the good fortune to run a group of newspapers on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, it was in the 80s, and it was just I remember that it was a hot summer day. Man, it was sweltering. We didn't have air conditioning in these offices where we were, and it was just sweltering. And I'm in there working. It's deadline day, and this woman comes in whom I did not know, young woman, and she was just bedraggled. Her hair was damp, perspiration. She had perspiration on her forehead, and she comes in and she gets past my secretary and gets into my office, and she sits down and she said, "My name is Lynn Bryant, and I run the battered women's shelter in Manio. And we don't have air conditioning in the building, and it's too hot for us to keep our clients there. We are going to have to close. And is there anything you can do?"
Wow.
And I thought, what? What are you talking about? I didn't even know that there was a domestic violence problem. Shame on me. I didn't even know there was a domestic violence problem on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It just never occurred to me, right? So she told me the story, how many people in Dare County, North Carolina, suffered from domestic violence. And I'd always been wanting to do this and never had the chance. I said, tear up the front page. So I interviewed her on the spot. I turned around. We had these old computers that hummed and made this horrible noise. And I turned around at my computer terminal and I asked her questions over my shoulder. And as she was telling me, I wrote this story. And we got it in the paper. We ran it with a banner headline, something about domestic, I forget the headline, but anyway, the shelter was closed. And so within about 2 weeks, I say we because I was later on that board to help the shelter, but within 2 weeks, people in the community had stepped forward and contributed either enough money, labor, and/or air conditioning equipment to outfit the shelter so that it could stay open.
Isn't that great?
Oh my God. It was the best thing ever. It really was. And it was that moment. It was that moment when Lynn came back in and said, "We're open for good," that I knew that I was in the right business.
What's next for Salisbury Independent? We've got 5 years under our belt. What are we going to do now?
Well, let's get the paper out next week. It's a weekly miracle.
Yes, it really is.
So, yeah.
He's Darel La Prade. He's my boss. Imagine the pressure of interviewing your boss on TV, and it just happened to me. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
I'm Greg Bassett from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. Another edition of 101 right here on PAC 14.
First Shore Federal is proud to support PAC 14 and one-on-one. We'd encourage every business to support PAC 14 and pick a program and support it, and let's make a difference.